is or was standing at the beginning of the gallery of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art for the Islamic section. So as you enter in the Islamic section, you saw it. And then really a vibrant discussion took place as to what makes it Islamic. Is it Islamic? Is it Sasanian? Is it Iranian? How do you define something like this that is from the probably 8th century era? A narrator of Adelkhah, where you find both ostragas, potsherd in both Pahlavi and Arabic. How do we place this period in our imagination? And I'll get back to this struggle. Well, about close to 20 years ago, Khalid Nazar, you remember, Nazar is here. Giti Azarbi wrote to me that Touraj, I would like you to come to Bancroft Library, Berkeley, as there have been some number of finds. Some 260 letters were found, which, according to the Bancroft carbon dating, would be between 666 and 888. This 2 centuries of quote silence that is very much discussed. And these were on leather and parchments. And through her kindness, I think I gave a talk, but a little bit later to the about them at UC Berkeley, where we find now in the archives that these are Vargabad, or an archive, or Bonabad as a depository of bone. So we have two. This is the first archive, which Nima Asefi has placed it in a cave place called Hastijan, the Hastijan cave, but I call it for us the Qom archive because it's in Qom. And then about a decade ago, a little bit more, 33 legal economic documents with bulas, with the seals attached to it, were also found, which Khodada Reza Khani suggests to be Espiris, somewhere close to Sari in the Savat Kuh region. And here on the bulla, you could see it says Dile Dilan, which I tend to read it as Gilan. I think this is a Gilan archive, which has been worked with really nicely by Dieter Weber, Maria Matsuch, early on by Philippe Gignoux under the editorialship of Rika Gisland in Res Orientalis. And here are some photos I took of my various trips to Delijan in the Qom area. Here's Dr. Afshar, which we went to see all the Chartagis in the region. And it's interesting in the number of Chartagis, these supposed fire altars, in the Qom area. One in the prison that we didn't get to, but there are still remains of many of them. This is Nimbar, which is really close to where the archive was found, and this is Delijan. So this is the region that we're talking about. And I'm just going to give you a couple of samples to give you a sense of what we can now read and try to now understand the everyday lives of people and, in a sense, forgotten voices that we never had. So here, for the first one, I've just given you a transcription that is not important, but it's translation. So this is from Qom area, right? To my rightly made, happier, beloved sister, Morvarid. So it's Morvarid Khanum that her letter is. She's getting every happiness. In this bottle of your own for Din Vindad, an equal share oil, 1 bottle. Sorry about the translation. So a bottle of oil. To the Lord you should send about your health and ease and that of Farukhzad to me. So tell me, how are you doing, please? Meanwhile, you should write, and with regards to me and my doing so at ease. So I'm put as ease. So we're getting really a type of a writing that is private and it's everyday, that we never had before. I give you a Tabaristan archive now example, which is longer in terms of the letters. Here we have an episode, and maybe I shouldn't read all of this, of a Dad Gushnasp and a certain number of men who have gone into in the village of Espres, into the house of a woman who's a wife of someone by the name of Diza. She's a Padakhshai wife. It is a class of Zoroastrian marriage, that be a type of Zoroastrian marriage, of Borzin Piruz, and her personal belongings have been stolen by these people. And now there should be a case, and they're putting up a case against these men who have rushed into this house. It's interesting that according to Zoroastrian law, she cannot make the official complaint. It has to be her husband. according to Zoroastrian. So really interesting details that we begin to see the letters dated to 755. It's year 104, and this year is important, day of Bahman. So they're using Zoroastrian dating, and this is, the Abbasids have staged their revolution, okay, already. Another Tabaristan archive, again, regarding another woman who is being kept from, as a wife, what she should have, her matrimony and so on. So she's now making a complaint about her husband. And the local village is saying, we have to, do investigation, and if he hasn't paid, he has to be punished. So really, I think, interesting material is coming out. This is the rest of it, again, 755 CE, another letter in this regard. Going back to Qom, the earliest evidence, we always talk about where's the first mosque in Iran, and it's an issue of, we don't find anything in the 1st century, but we do find this strip where in Middle Persian, dated post 715 CE, in the name of God Yazd. In Zoroastrian Middle Persian text is usually Yazdan, plural of the gods, right? So we know here something has changed. Although it's in Pahlavi, it's in the name of God, singular. And there's a surveillance or some sort of reconnaissance of the mazgitan, of the mosques around, for the Ostandar. So we are at the cusp of seeing Muslims being present on the Iranian plateau. And at the same time, on the same archive, we have receipts of Mr. Mardoy, the wine grower. So wine is being grown, and there are vintners producing wine, and the mosques are there and are sort of being reconnaissance and so on. A very interesting, I think, on-the-ground information that, of course, this is the purview of philologists, and indeed, it should be until they're deciphered. This is the 2nd generation of decipherment. And then it's the work of historians to try to say, okay, so we have these documents. What can we tell about the social economic history of people? Going back to the Qom archive, here there seems to have been a party thrown by the Ostandar, and the Arabs are present. And they say, okay, let's have a party, and let's have vinegar, tarinag, which is chives probably, cumin, wheat, and so on, and we should give them some, and we should have some. So again, a relation between the Arabs and the Iranians on the plateau is being discussed. Again, one more, there's a sacrifice for the god Mehr in year 690 probably. And they say, okay, give one of the sheep to the local Amir, who's a Muslim, and we'll do the other one for the god Mehr. But at the same time, there are piglets running around because the Iranians are making biryani probably out of it, as we hear first. And we hear all sorts of interesting details. In this document, which I supplied to Dieter Weber from Tehran, we find that there are Nestorian Christians, Surigan, around Qom. They have their own places. The Tazigan are already present, and these are probably, has been suggested, to be Ash'ari Arabs from Yemen who've moved there, and the local rats, the priests who are signing off on some of these complaints. So everybody is doing their own thing. So my general observations in this 20 minutes, and I have really sort of tried to go quickly, is we begin to get a micro-history of an Iranian village or settlements, something that we did not, because of the sources that we had, relations, connections, prosopography of 7th and 8th century, dietary and economic history. We hear about ruzik, daily rations. We can now almost see what the daily rations of an Iranian in the 7th and 8th century was, as well as legal history of marriage laws, contracts, and debts. So really fascinating. As I said, the microhistory we find in letters that these people, keeper of archives, an elder, a scribe, a king of Paribashgar, and several people are mentioned. So we can get actually what was going on in this little village, or maybe a bit bigger, on 755, which is 20 of Mehr, as the letter says, year 104, day of Farvardin, or Fravardin. Two other letters that really are interesting to me is about a tailor, a darzik, who for Nowruz is instructed to make a shoe, muzag pa, 2 pants, shalwar, and a pirahan pambak, a cotton shirt, please. So apparently they like cotton shirts, but we also find of ideas of medicine and all sorts of things for caretaking and so on. So it's that type of information that we suddenly are presented with, at least for 2 locations. In terms, at the end of this, what does this year mean? Year 1041, so on. So the Yazdgirdi date that these texts are using match the coins. They're not from the coming of Yazdgir to the throne. The Sasanians used the throne years, but rather his death. So already in the mind of the Iranians, a new era has begun. They're not using Hijra, but what they're using is a post-Yazdgir year. So in their mind, they already have a notion of this is a post-Sasanian world. And that's why, as Judith Lerner has emphasized, I will emphasize that the first 100 years is really a post-Sasanian period. You could use early Islamic, but for the people living on the plateau, it was a post-Sasanian. It was just called post-Yazdgird. And this is apparent on the coin. And so this block that I showed you, this stucco, to me is a post-Sasanian. Neither really can be called Islamic or Sasanian. And to end, I think things change from the documents and the coinage. And these are Bactrian documents that were also found during the war in Afghanistan about 30 years ago. Those are interesting in themselves that end in the 8th century about the same time. So we have Balkh, and we have Qom, and we have Tabaristan, that really by 780s, by the end of the 8th century, Iran is changing in that, for example, I would use the date of Muhammadiyah. The old Ray, is replaced by Muhammadiyah by the Abbasids, where they now begin to use the Hijri dating on their coin, but also call the place not Ray anymore, but Muhammadiyah. Coincides with almost all of these documents. That's when I think a new phase in Iranian history is taking place. So I wanted to just touch upon this 100 years of forgotten history. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ali Ferdowsi, Emeritus Professor at Notre Dame de Namur University. His work has focused on history and political science, with publications that have dealt with many key aspects of Iranian nationhood and identity. He's also provided pioneering research on the career of Haji Sayyar and US-Iran relations, and I would say, even more importantly, on Hafiz. Please.
Thank you so much. After this excellent scholarly paper, I don't know what to say. But first, let me thank UNAM, thank Museo Nacional das Culturas del Mundo, and IAS for hosting and for inviting me to be on a panel that when I first heard that I am invited to, I thought that it must be a mistake. And I hope that by the end you do not think that I was right. At any rate, as soon as I looked at the topic, one thing, the word that jumped at me was the word lost. And many years ago, I watched a movie by the great Mexican director, Alejandro González Iñárritu, called Amores Perros. I think many of you have seen that movie. And at the end of the movie, as you know, when the movie fades out, there is a dedication, white text on black, and I think that's perhaps significant, in which it says, I'm going to read it in Spanish, because I tried to memorize it. Let's see if I can manage it. A Luciano, porque también somos lo que hemos perdido. To Luciano, because we are also what we have lost. And I immediately, after I watched the movie, that word lost, I don't know much about Mexico and who Luciano was. I did some Google search, but not enough to really say anything about that, except that I felt that dedication resonated with me because I believe, and I speak perhaps only for myself, we Iranians also live in the ruins of a lost future. And when I reflected on the topic, I wasn't sure what I am going to read, to say, but I thought that okay, for an archivist, the recovery of the voice is ecumenical. They don't care. All voices have to be recovered. But if you are like me, consider yourself a political activist before you consider yourself as a scholar, and your scholarship is the service of your political activism. Not all voices. Voices are really the place for contest, for suppression, and for you know, it's a fight. It's whose voice gets to be heard is not a scholarly matter. It's really a matter of fight and struggle. Because of that, and at the same time, I thought that okay, what I could say that is not like one of the papers I have been in those panels that make up the bulk of a conference like this one, as a member of this association as well. But I thought that what should I say that would not be would be different, that would be open to a wider audience, and also relate to what is happening today in Iran, and what is it that people like me are confronting at this very moment. And so, and then it was that earlier I was planning to talk about the relationship between Haj Sayyah and Sultan Ahmad Jalaieh. Some of you may know that with the collaboration of Dr. Sanaz Rajabian, we finally published the a critical edition of Divan Sultan Ahmad Jalaieh, a very, very, very important, I think, Divan, because it's a Divan of a king. And then we can understand Hafiz much better in terms of what is the dialogue between the king and the poet, at any rate. But I decided to switch to Haj Sayyah. And of course, we cannot say Haj Sayyah's voice is totally forgotten, but it certainly is suppressed. His book is not yet gets official permission to be published in Iran. And as a way of bringing this situation to view, I will start by quoting a few sentences from a speech by the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ali Khamenei, delivered in 1998 to a group of students at Tehran University. The speech was on the topic of intellectuals, or rather intellectualism, Roshan Fikri. Quote, "Our intellectualism was born sick, unhealthy, and deformed, bimar, nasalem, va ma'yub. Because those who formed the first generation of our intellectual history were sick people. For the moment, I name three. Mirza Malkam Khan, the Armenian, they emphasize that every time they mention his name, Mirza Fatali Akhundzadeh, and Haj Sayyah Mahallati." Now, what made them sick? That's the answer of Ayatollah. Targeting religion, people's beliefs, and authentic native traditions. In other words, they were sickened by modernity, which translates in the theological, political arena as not putting themselves exclusively at the service of the institution of religion as the presumed haven of tradition and memory. Now, the speech was among the most memorable speeches of the Supreme Leader. Let us fast forward to the ceremony to promote Sardar Hossein Salami, the head of the IRGC, to the rank of general a month after the bloody suppression of the Awan 98, the November 2019 uprising. On that day, Sardar Salami gave a speech that so delighted be wajd avurd the Supreme Leader that he asked that it be published in thousands of copies. In that speech, the general placed the blame for the uprising of Tir 78, Intikhabat 88, and Awan 98 squarely at the door of the inferior and reactionary copies of the likes of Mirza Malkam Khan, Mirza Fatali Akhundzadeh, Haj Sayyah. They were, he went on to explain, the enablers, fa'algar, of these riots. Now, recently, a book of mine titled Haj Sayyah و کشف آزادی جستارهایی در توانشناسی سوژه مدرن در ایران Haj Sayyah and the Discovery of Freedom, Essays on the Genealogy of the Modern Subject in Iran, came out in Tehran. I wrote that book in part in response to these speeches. I quoted from both the Ayatollah and the general without attribution and devoted a good part of one of the chapters to Haj Sayyad's views on the institution of religion. Sadly, a substantial part of that section, amounting to several pages, had to be excised by the order of the Bureau of Censorship. I'm going to share the gist of it, lest my noise disappears in the ghostly realm of forgotten voices. But before that, a few words for those of you who don't know who Haj Sayyad is. Haj Sayyad was born in 1836. He was the first Iranian to officially become a US citizen in 1875 after his application was expedited by President Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the Civil War, who invited him to the White House. At the time, Haj Sayyad had traveled the world for some 16 years and had met quite a roster of big names of the time. As it is relevant to our talk, let me also say that he was trained to become a mullah and attended the seminaries in Isfahan and Najaf and remained a believer throughout his life. The part that had to be excised was about my attempt at gathering Sayyad's observations into a framework that I have picked up from Spinoza. I say a framework and not a theory because I'm not using it to explain Sayyad, but simply to lend my talk a shape, a background. In Spinoza's views, whose theological political treatise I have translated into Persian, the so-called world of Abrahamic religions, where God has given it its first constitution to Moses on Mount Sinai, modern subjects in their attempt to erect a collective order have to deal not with a single mode called the political, but rather with a theological political complex. In other words, they must solve a system of equations with two variables, the political and the theological, such that any value for one determines a value for the other. Spinoza treats religion not so much as an ideology, but as a kind of power, along with the political. Once we see religion as a kind of power, then Sayyad's observations emerge as having the shape of a vicious triangle. I know the triangle does not circle, but it's a vicious triangle nonetheless, which I call Musallase Tabahi or Musallase Inhitat, the triangle of degeneracy. The most succinct expression of the triangle of degeneracy is perhaps found in the following. This is a quote from Haj Sayyad. Of all places that I have seen, this is towards the end of 19th century, of all places that I have seen, Iran is the worst, since nowhere is in such a state of demise and destitution. This is because in the whole world, oppression by the rulers is not so intense and the influence of ignorance by the mullahs so far-reaching. These two millstones crush the whole people with extreme force and ferocity. In protecting oneself against these two forces, everyone is driven to hypocrisy and lies, and that in turn leads to moral degeneration. The triangle of degeneracy is easy to see. We are talking about the condition of political demise, social disarray, and moral turpitude prevailing among three interacting agent positions: the state, the religious super institution, and the people. The masses of Iranian people are subject to two kinds of power, one that works on them brutally from the outside, and one that acts both on them and through them from the inside. This is Sayyad's sociological analysis. He does not hypostasize this degeneracy into a timeless Iranian cultural essence or a history. There is no going back to the usual suspects, like the much maligned Mongol hordes or the Arab invasion. The subjectivizing relation is not between a people and a history, but among three interacting agent positions. Sayyad distinguishes between power and agency. He neither reduces agency to power nor power to its outward naked state form. On his way back from India to Iran, their ship makes a 3-hour-long port call at Karachi. As usual, Sayyad is not one to miss the opportunity to see a nearby site. It is a square pound filled with clear water. 17 crocodiles, he counts. 17 crocodiles are lounging in the water with their eyes shut. Several pilgrims arrive. With them, they have a small herd of lambs. They proceed to sanctify the lambs with incantations, and by putting mascara around their eyes, they next tie each lamb's legs and throw them into the pond. Crocodiles calmly parted their eyelids, opened their mouths, tore the lambs apart, and swallowed them. This is a parable. He explains it in a rare metatextual reflection. It's a strange world. It seems like it is an ordinance of creation that ordinary working folk should toil and suffer, and a group of fortunate ones should enjoy the fruits of their labor. Many are under the thumbs of oppressors who forcibly take away what they earn. If some of them are spared this condition, they themselves deprive themselves of their earnings and put it on the plate of the fortunate ones because of their belief in superstitions. Even when they do not find someone from the human species, they prostrate themselves in front of crocodiles, cows, trees, or stones and ask for their wishes to be granted. Let us briefly talk about these three these agent positions. The officialdom in Iran's view, in Sayyah's view, the officialdom engages in oppression and exploitation for three sets of interrelated reasons. First, the rulers, because of the specific features of the reproduction of political power in Iran, are essentially a bunch of unqualified men who are consequently led to a pretense of power instead of the exercise of actual authority. Their power requires to be conspicuous to be felt. For this reason, they have to demonstrate it by extravagant brutality and pomposity to each other and to the populace. Second, precisely because of this real emptiness of power, the extended reproduction of the structure of state power in Iran proceeds with a tremendous degree of insecurity. This leads to an unregulated and ruthless kind of a game in which conspiracy, bribery, office buying, disloyalty, and backstabbing prevail. The work of life is hard in Iran, and one has to live constantly in fear, intimates Amin al-Sultan, the powerful chancellor of Nasiruddin Shah, to Haj Sayyah. Third, the Iranian elite, from the king down to the lowliest state functionary, know better ways to running things than they practice. This too is a structural effect. This system is bound to a particular order of knowledge and know-how. Now, exactly because of its mereology, the withdrawal of any one part at any level from exercising force does not reduce the total amount of oppression. On the contrary, Sayyah repeatedly shows that it increases it, for it opens it yet another space for other players who now have to stage their show of power anew. They have to regain the power. They have to show it again. Here is another factor that makes things even worse. When a ruler decides to relax his grip on power, as the system at its highest level is a theological political system, any reduction in the power of an office holder inevitably has repercussions for the boundaries between the theological and the political domains of power. On his way from Bushehr to Mahallat, shortly after his return to Iran, Sayyah spends about 3 weeks in Shiraz. In a conversation he has with Qawam al-Mulk, the governor general proudly explains to him that he has established peace and security in his realm by in his own words, chopping heads and gashing abdomens. Reflecting on this, Haj Sayyah says, in Iran, if the ruler, Hakim, is weak, he would not be able to commit oppression. And then from among the mullahs and the generals and the more powerful others, 1,000 oppressors rise up. On the other hand, if the ruler is powerful, he would be the sole oppressor, and perhaps it could be said that a single oppressor is better than many oppressors. Although sharing in the quality of oppressiveness, the mullah's power the mullah's power and the power of the state are different in some respects. Sayyah avails himself of the metaphor of hunting in speaking of both, but they differ in that the state rulers are hunters of the human body, while the mullahs are the hunters of his soul, shekarchiyan ruh. And as they lure the souls of the ordinary and powerless people into their traps, they are far more efficient, perduring, and harder to escape. Sayyah also observes that the brute power of a state is not always superior to the power of men who have the unpaid army of the religious followers, muqallid, behind them. In the pious city of Yazd, a mullah, having produced a bogus marriage document with the daughter of Sayyah's host, is asking her father for money to annul the contract. Unwilling to put up with the extortion, the father pleads with the city's governor. You have no choice but to pay him, advises the governor. Quote, our life, the governor says, our life and death are in their hands. They forge a document for one, stick their nose into every affair, declare one a believer and the other an infidel. Could I now say that this mullah is lying? If they were to consort with each other and accuse me of injustice or declare me a Babi or claim that I took a bribe and raise the banner, woe be Islam, what am I to do? Are we not forced to practice dissimulation, taqiyya, with them, criticize them, and you are told you are offending a mujtahid, denounce them, and you are treated as if you have denounced God and the Prophet? But the people are not passive victims. They participate in perpetuating the condition of degeneracy. No matter how awful a situation, people try to find ways to navigate it, to protect themselves and pursue their interests. And in doing so, they function to perpetuate it. Not only have they lost their wealth, their industries, and their commerce, but they also have lost their dignity, izzat, and their honor, ghayrat. They have become morally corrupt, hedonistic, lazy, freeloading, tambal, muftkhor, thieves, and crooks. We need an entire presentation to discuss Sayyah's anthropology of this character complex. Sayyah specifically emphasizes work ethics. The inhabitants of Iran, he judges, do not want to earn a living by the hardship of work, industry, and business. As a result, they listen to anyone who tells them that if you recite this prayer or hold such a religious ceremony or give some bribe to an overlord or money to an alchemist, you will achieve your goal. Note that Sayyah considers bribing the powerful, engaging in magic, and beseeching a saint to be functionally equivalent. Moral turpitude belongs to the same complex. They all consider flattery, hypocrisy, lying, dishonesty to be necessary. They praise or alternatively besmirch one another without meaning any of it. They are all suspicious of each other, and none speaks frankly to another. People are so habituated to these that we could say they have slipped into their nature. We perhaps need a Foucault to go over this with us, but as he is dead, let me conclude. Sayyah returns to Iran after nearly 18 years of search to find out what it means to be human in the modern world. He says that to himself. He returns home as a modern subject. As such, he sees a chasm between a world he needs in order to be an at-home subject and a world steeped in habits and norms that are harmful, even lethal, for the modern subject. From within his new subjectivity, he sees this world as a triangle of degeneracy. The befitting world that he strived for and for which he was exiled, imprisoned, and was about to be killed has yet to be fully achieved, in part because his voice was and continues to be suppressed. Oh, Luciano, we too are also what we have lost. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is going to be Professor Eliz Sanasarian, Professor of Political Science at the University of Southern California. Dr. Sanasarian has worked on many aspects of gender and religious studies in Iran, most particularly on religious minorities in Iran and the women's rights movement. In fact, I must say that as a graduate student, her books were among the top on my list of books to have to read. So, it's particularly nice finally to put the name and the individual, the author and the thinker together. So her publications, as I said, are regarded as seminal, as key studies in the field. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sanasarian.
Thanks to the committee for inviting me. Can you hear me?
No.
You can put this.
Your mic is okay.
Just doesn't matter.
In a vat. Yeah, try this.
No, you need this.
Oh, you need the whole thing.
Okay. Well, I was thanking the committee for inviting me. I also want to thank the organizers, including people who are out there trying to serve us goodies. I don't know if you have smelled the roses, they are real. I want to share with you some of my experiences uh, in the aftermath of the publication of my books and use them to address some possible hurdles, pitfalls, and emergent issues. A colleague of mine with a background in anthropology, but a political scientist, told me many years ago, whatever we write has a personal dimension to it. I rolled my eyes and I thought, well, of course, your background was anthropology, you'll say that. But as years have gone by, I've come to agree with her. My first work on the women's rights movement in Iran had a personal dimension, but I wasn't aware of it when I wrote it. It was dedicated to Fatimeh, not the daughter of Prophet Muhammad, but the person I dedicated the book to had characteristics attributed in literature to the Prophet's daughter: enduring suffering, generosity, and compassion. The Fatimeh I dedicated my book to was a Lori, a Sufi, couldn't read or write, but had an amazing memory of poetry, and she would recite poetry. She moved to our house before I was born, and she became a mother to my mother and a mother, grandmother, friend, guide, and everything else to me. In my wallet today, there is a picture of only one family member, and it's her picture. When I turned 9, she put me on her lap and she said, "You're lucky to have parents that are not going to force you to marry." I was married to a 30-year-old man when I turned 9. And she shared with me 2 memories that she had from her wedding night. The first one was that she was sitting on these high chairs that they put the bride and groom on. And she was surrounded by adults. They were talking all the time. She didn't understand what they were saying, and she was very bored, and she thought she should have brought her doll to play with. The second memory was that she looked down and noticed that everybody's feet touched the floor except hers. And she tried very hard to reach and touch the floor, and she couldn't. And she felt very embarrassed. These were the 2 main memories of her wedding night. Okay. I realized only later to what an extent my subconscious was influenced by her and her love. You should know that I didn't plan to go into academia. This will surprise many people. I was kind of pushed into it. I prepared to work at the United Nations. As a graduate student, I did internship at United Nations Children's Fund for the highest ranking woman at the time at the UN. And I knew everybody in New York headquarters. And that was my goal. So I geared everything I did in academia for that. When I got my PhD, I had several job offers, but they were from departments that I didn't want to be in. And the UN system at the time was famous for discriminating against women. So you could have had a PhD and you would have been working for a man without a high school degree. And so I didn't want to put myself in that situation. So I was kind of pushed into academia because the UN didn't work for me. So I entered it with naivete and disconnect from academic world. I hadn't played the game right. I didn't even know there was a game to be played. So when my book was published, I had a lot of negative experiences. A quarter of a century after the publication of the book, Nushin Khorasani, whom I didn't know and still don't know, translated the book to Persian, and it won the Best Book Prize in Iran. And that was the biggest award anybody could give me in academia. I want to share with you two funny experiences from the aftermath of the publication of the first book. The first one was the book had just been published, and I was in the library of UCLA. There were several PhD candidates or maybe new PhDs right there. They approached me and they said, "Have you read the review of your book in a specific journal? It's very long and very negative." So my first response was, why would anybody write about my book? Why they don't go write their own book? So that gives you an idea of my state of mind. And then I was told I should go to Middle Eastern Studies Association meetings. So I didn't know what that was. So I went to the first MESA conference after the book was published, and I felt I had entered the twilight zone. Years later, an Egyptian anthropologist trying to describe her first experience in Middle Eastern Studies Association said it reminded her of the fruit markets of Cairo. And that's exactly the feeling I had when I got in. I tell you one experience there. So I entered the elevator, and the elevator door opens, and an Iranian guy walks in. And of course, we all have these tags. Stares at my tag and says, "Ah, you are Sanasarian. I just read your book and gave it a very negative review. I tore it into pieces." So my response is, "Oh, what was wrong with it?" And he said, "I'm not going to tell you. You have to find out for yourself." And then he rants a bit, and then the elevator door opens and he walks out. And I said, "But where did you publish it?" And he said, "I'm not going to tell you that." And the elevator door closes and he walks out. But you know, the only thing I really remember is he was spitting on me as he was talking. He was constantly spitting on me. So decades go by, decades. And I'm in another conference. All of a sudden, the guy appears in front of me and says, "So you are still around?" I guess. He says, "And doing the same thing in the same place." I said, "Yes, I guess." Starts ranting again, and he's spitting. And all I'm thinking about is this the spitting guy in the elevator, and I should get his name, but he's not giving me a chance. He spit, he talked, he spit, and he disappeared. So if he's here, it's COVID time. Don't come near me. You are right. You were always right. I'm wrong. Don't spit. The worst experience on a more serious side was the wrath of female academics after the publication of the women's rights movement in Iran. This surprised me. They set up their own grouping. All of a sudden, a group of women who had not seen inside of a mosque, like I had, became Muslim women and the only ones who had the self-delegated right to talk and write about Muslim women. But it was my negative experiences with females in academia which pushed me into a different topic, and that was religious and ethnic minorities. And I tell you why that was significant. I was the most unlikely person to write about minorities. I was brought up in a multi-ethnic and multi-religious setting. I never saw myself as a minority, but my experiences drove me into this topic. At this point, I was more, the best word I can use, kar koshte, about the modus operandi of academia. So I had developed a habit of having my work read by experts before sending it for publication, and I brought more people on board. because I recognized the fault lines. I cared about the byproduct. I felt it was an important issue. More input, I felt, will make it better. However, I had to be careful, and for a number of reasons. Number one, stealing, plagiarism, the stealing of ideas, the stealing of issues. I know some of you have had this concern and problem. Academics, I think especially older academics, can't be that creative, so they latch on. So I had to really protect the material because it was based on primary sources, also field work inside Iran. If this was daunting, there was another serious problem, and that was security. Islamic Republic and its lackeys in academia were very sensitive about this issue. So I kept copies of, if you remember, in those days we had diskettes, old computers. I kept one copy in my purse, one hidden in my house that only I knew, one in my aunt's Hollywood apartment, one in a safe deposit box, and one in my messy office. After the publication of the book, I felt I was paranoid. It was just pure paranoia until in a conference, I was approached by a Scandinavian scholar who shared her experiences that she and her husband returned home with their children. The door was open, and there was an Iranian guy going through her papers. And when they asked him, "What are you doing here?" he pulled out a knife and came towards them. The husband threw himself in front of the children and said, "Stab me, save my children." She threw herself in front of her husband and said, "Stab me, I'm the one who writes on religious minorities." The guy with the knife got confused and didn't know whom to stab, but at the same time got nervous, peed in his pants, and ran out of the house. I reduced my academic publications, I reduced my conference attendance to avoid revealing or calling attention to myself. I will save you some of my experiences in publication of the book, Religious Minorities. Generally, they were positive, but I will save you that part. The thing I want to talk about now is when you want to recover lost voices, you have to be on guard. First, is the community of academics ready for it? If they are not, are you ready to pay the price? I review many articles and books. I turn down most requests, but the ones that I do, I have to say from my experience, I see only two fields where you can really sound voiceless, bring the voice of the voiceless into it. One is history, and the other one is anthropology. The other thing I want to point out is that there is also a generational change. I don't see much of that. I've seen some, but not much in political science, which is my field. But I see more of it in other fields. And the presentations that I've heard also point to a generational change in that younger generation wants to go for newer topics, for the voiceless, and in newer ways of addressing them. The second point is, and this is very important for graduate students, can you address voiceless ones in a fair and objective fashion? Academics can easily slip into advocacy, and I don't think our role is advocacy. If you remain centered, you are getting the point across. I want to give you an example. When I was doing my second book, I knew that recognized religious minorities inside Iran would be the first to deny evidence-based scholarship about themselves. I used that knowledge to center my work and increase my objectivity in the way in which I wrote it and expressed it. Also, Professor Shahrukh Akhavi whom I loved and trusted 100%, would often read my publications, the ones that were about Iran. When I sent my manuscript to him, I asked him to watch for my words and expressions to make sure that they are more controlled. And it becomes very hard to be controlled when you are reading religious fundamentalist literature and it doesn't make any sense. So he found like half a dozen, which is a compliment. I thought I had more. The third point is, and this is also important, don't expect perfection. Since not much has come before your work, there will always be imperfections. And so you do your best in the hope that others can build up on it and move from there. The problem with academia is, however, we don't want to build up on what others have done with appreciation. We want to knock them down. It's not a knockdown issue. It's really building up what others have done before you. And the last point I want to make, and this is very much, it comes from my manuscript that I am finished with, which is about characteristics of grassroots groups. I think academics are hindered on many levels, which prevents them from access to inner recesses of the voiceless. Part of it, I think, is elitism, and that includes those in the left of the political spectrum. One thing I don't forget at Mesa, of course, in 1990s, was this discussant, a woman, who was condemning everybody on the panel, criticizing everybody as she's moving her hands. And she has all these golden bracelets that are jiggling. And I thought, that image stayed with me. And that is elitism. I want to finish my talk by a quotation from one of my favorite philosophers, Krishnamurti, who wrote in 1950s. Many of us seem to think that by teaching every human being to read and write, we shall solve our human problems. But this idea has proved to be false. The so-called educated are not peace-loving, integrated people, and they too are responsible for the confusion and misery of the world. The right kind of education means the awakening of intelligence, the fostering of an integrated life. And only such education can create a new culture and a peaceful world. But to bring about a new kind of education, we must make a fresh start on an entirely different basis.
Thank you very much. Our fourth panelist on the keynote panel today is Fariba Adelkhah. Dr. Adelkhah is a Franco-Iranian researcher and anthropologist who's based at Sciences Po in Paris. Her work focuses on Shiism and Iran's post-revolutionary society. As we know, she was detained in Iran from, I think this is correct, from June 2019 to February 2023. And we are very honored to have her today with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really very happy. As you see, we have very different way to talk about the title, Forgotten Past, Recovering Lost Voices Through Scholarship. So I just feel at ease to serve you my way of thinking about the issue. But before that, I have not enough word to thank my dear Firoozeh and Shekufe for their invitation really, it was something I was looking for without having the courage to make it this trip. Thank you really very much. I just feel honored. So I want to take advantage of this invitation, very kind invitation, that without Farov to be next to Eliz, to Wado, and with all of these nice panelists. I want to take advantage of this this invitation and to talk about my last field work as an anthropologist. That would help to find some of the answers to the question we received, and also in the Q&A session, I will try to answer better to your question anyway. It is during the summer of 2023, thanks to Clubhouse social network and through the confession of the former director of Evin prison, Hossein Mortazavi Zanjani, in office in the years in 1987, 1988, that broke the silence on the mass execution of political prisoners at the end of the war against Iraq. What Ayatollah Montazeri called it as a crime. A debate followed, which was still very timid. This allowed us to shed light on the responsibilities, not only of the individual, but also of the political framework itself. It also allows us to hear and make heard the voice of victims' family, their suffering, their demands, and to remedy as much as possible the irremediable damage that this silence of a few decades has produced in their life. Invited by a journalist who is currently living in Iran, Masoud Moayyedi, Mortazavi had responded for approximately 5 hours to a panel of experts, political leaders, personalities, opponents, parents, in order to verify certain facts. He didn't say anything new, not even regarding the number of victims, which varies from 2,000 to 8,000. Moreover, no one needed it to measure the extent of the disaster. But he made it easier to understand the climate of the time and the decision-making chaos that reigned at that time in the prison. He confirmed the dramatic stories that were circulating. He insisted that he had no intention of atoning for his sins, which he considered impermissible and unforgivable, nor to cleanse or justify a regime that he no longer had any faith in. He simply feels the duty to tell the truth. That is the whole word. To tell the truth about the facts against which he did not speak out at the time, even though he knew what was happening around him. So the necessity is to speak out the truth in itself and for oneself, so that it may be recorded before one's die. He said he was convinced that the order to carry out this execution did not come from Imam Khomeini, and that Prime Minister at that period, Mir Hossein Mousavi, had not been kept informed. Thus, while the clamor of the women life freedom movement resounded in society, the intervention of Mortazavi and the debates which followed confirmed that the restitution of the truth is the major condition for a normal life, as Shervin Hajipur beautiful songs say. The subject returned to the forefront a year later during the July 2024 presidential election. Milad Dokanchi raised without embarrassment and ambiguity the question of responsibility of one of the candidates, Mustafa Pur Mohammadi, in the traumatic execution, those of the summer of 1988. Former prosecutor, former Minister of Justice, he did nothing of his role. He hid nothing of his role in what we call the constellation of death in 1988. But he recalled with calm and without any embarrassment that he was then only a judge, that the responsibility for the facts fell to an entire system, to the regime. He clarified that he had not been part of the committee, 30 in number, which selected the condemned, questioned them one last time, and pronounced the death sentence. He even claimed that the reason for his presence in this constellation of deaths was to try to moderate the ardor of the decision makers, to limit their excess, and to dissuade them from massacring all the prisoners in the mad hope of suppressing all opposition to the new regime. Restore the truth, therefore. But what about the truth if it does not exist? What happens if it is hidden behind the suppression, transformation, and composition of other truths, which may be segmentary, but which are nonetheless justified in a society that is itself segmented? It is easy to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, when it is a monologue and you are alone and responsible for your own affairs, before a court charged with judging you. But it becomes much, much more complicated, if not impossible, when we want to shed fair light, even if only on certain fragmentary aspects of post-revolutionary prison life. And moreover, how can we select this aspect, these sequences, by isolating them from the magma of revolutionary history? We are less concerned with the meaning of history, which we think we know, than with the men who made it, often without knowing it, and who, in a certain way, were its toys as much as the actors. An eternal problem that historians of Second World War, the German occupation of France, and the Algerian War are well aware of. Telling the truth is a duty and responsibility that falls on everyone's shoulder, but expressing it in the context of a tumultuous and furious period during which action prevails over consultation and revolutionary consensus over all other consideration is a more complex issue that necessitates greater responsibility, because it comes from another logic and mobilizes other pairs than the classic opposition between truth and lie, or opacity or conspiracy, truth and crime, truth and consensus. Even if there is no other urgency than this duty of truth, if only because of the moral debt we owe to the family of victims, let us not give in to the temptation of populism. Let us not reduce the truth. Let us not limit it to the level of the denunciation of a few responsible people, however tortured they have been, and especially since many of them are now resting in peace in their eternal home after having had a national funeral and worthy of their work. Let us not reduce the truth, either to a few vengeful execution on the day of the next revolution to ease the pain of families. In short, let us not underestimate either the depth of these wounds or the extent of the field of necessary truth in the exceptional political situation that Iran has gone through. Because the essential remain undoubtedly the lesson that we should draw from them, the teaching that remain for us to propagate, even if it involved political or intellectual disturbance. It is, of course, necessary for us to shed light on what was committed, how it was committed, and why. However, what about the silence that was kept during, before, and after it? The fact is that the story unfolded less in the relative clarity of public space than in the opacity of activist homes, Khanehai Timi, and behind prison walls. The leaders of the Islamic Republic were able to take advantage of their own prison experience during the Shah's era alongside prisoners of the revolutionary left and the Mujahideen by establishing relationship with them and recruiting them. This is how the different tendencies of the left and the Mujahideen will compete to become denunciator agent, whether for conviction, whether because of conviction, whether out of conviction, spying, or simply survival, even of their former comrades. This should not conceal the courage, the self-sacrifice, the sacrifice of those undoubtedly much more numerous who resisted threat, temptation, torture, and who also want today to settle these scores, their scores. There is a silence there that is not easy to break, whatever our desire for truth. Just as it is not easy to talk about the absolute ostracism which hate activists suspected of having spoken under torture and which sometimes forced them to commit suicide in the prison. Finally, there is the silence that the leaders impose on the base of, on the execution, on the sympathizers, out of the integrity and indivisibility of the organization, whose indisputable primacy prevails. In a sense, there is a reason for a state even before it has access to power. I can hear some of your objections, if not your indignation. How can we confuse the action of the dominant and those of dominated? How can we place on the same level responsibilities and action which do not have the same weight, not the same means? But that is not my intention. I just want to remind you in a prosaic way that what stands in the way of the truth today is the truth itself, because it does not exist in the singular. Furthermore, and at the risk of repeating myself, the history of the Islamic Republic was largely made behind the wall of its prison, which are not very talkative. 40 or 30 years later, the problem for a prisoner remain the same, to restore the truth, but behind this term, there are so many silences, always the same, and also no one. Evin has undoubtedly changed a lot and no longer has much in common with what it was, except that a cage, even golden, remains a cage. I'm an anthropologist for whom the observation of facts, practices, transformation is important, whether these are happy or unhappy, public or invisible, and confined to prison isolation, because they are always field of investigation, windows of opportunity, and warning signs. To ignore them is to ignore reality, that is to say, the truth. Even apart from the constant rearrangement of the confinement and living environment, the institution has become more complex. The men who worked there during the constellation of death, when there was a constant threat of torture and execution, are not present anymore. In exchange of their service and undoubtedly their silence, they received advantage to go and work elsewhere on their own account. I met some of them. We respected the imperative of silence without ever saying it, and not for the same reason, but I won't add anything more. Reading the testimony of prisoner from this time reveals a prison without, you can imagine, telephone, without social network, where prisoners were forced to observe religious practices and repent, where it was often necessary to sleep alternatively due to lack of space in the cell, or even in dormitories so cramped that they were called coffin, and that the repression filled to excess, where the whip cracked without respite, where the slightest summon could end in a shutout that the other inmate heard distinctly the next evening, where those condemned to death were forcibly married off so that they would not enter the afterlife as virgin, a prison where individuals were not given sufficient food, care, or hygiene. Today, Evin has renewed and rejuvenated its management, a process which seems permanent. There we meet well-dressed young people in the spirit of the time who wear makeup, undergo cosmetic surgery, study, speak foreign languages, work there as a family and as a couple, mother and daughter, husband and wife in different departments. However, when you think about it, Evin remained the word of silence. Silence imposed by the authorities on the real reason for incarceration, on the content of the files, on the judicial investigation, on the exchange of prisoners, even on the executions, but also silence of the prisoner who tried to protect their cause, their honor, that of their family, their ties, the two silence, that of the one of the oppressor and that of the oppressed, combined to make even a realm of cacophony, inaudible, often on purpose. We are required to remain silent, not only because of the authoritarianism of the prison institution or out of fear, but out of respect for our fellow prisoners who have prisons that reason ignores. I did not want to be involved in these prison stories, which are both those of the oppressor and those of the oppressed. This happened in spite of me, and now I don't know how to break away from it. It was in spite of myself that I met young women who knew nothing about politics, but who frequented the world of politics and whose imprisonment allowed one faction to challenge another one. It was also in spite of myself that I learned that we do not all go to prison for the same reason, that some foment immigration projects there which are not necessarily of a political nature, that others take refuge there to study far from family constraint or to build up political or symbolic capital. It was in spite of myself that I learned that the Islamic Republic is building up a stock of prisoners, possibly binational or foreigners, to negotiate its financial assets, its property, and its diplomatic relations. It was in spite of myself that I learned that certain opposition group, well established, maintained sufficiently cordial relation with its security service to have had access to my family album, confiscated with my computer during my arrest, and to publish it on Ahmad News, whose founder was captured in Iraq in 2019 and hanged in Iran in December 2020. It was always in spite of myself that I learned that word of political prisoner was not only made up of opponents of the Islamic Republic, but also of some of its servants and supporters, or of members of its family of martyrs, children of commanders, or children of deputies on ministry. As the beginning of the revolution, the link between prisoner and the political regime are often close. Finally, it was in spite of myself that I learned that the interrogators, failing to find political evidence against you, are taking over your private life, your emotional and sexual ties, by rummaging through your computer and your digital correspondence on your mobile phone, and thus have a formidable weapon to the detriment of their prisoner, who are neither the same age as me, nor have the same economic autonomy, and live in silence with the anxiety of having their personal lives exposed in the public arena. The Iranian Civil War, because that is what it is, took place largely in prison, so the factional conflicts. I did not try to find out what it was because that would break the silence. Sometimes that neither the authorities of the Islamic Republic nor its opposition have allowed me to do, which has already begun to reproach me for my writing, as in the past, because of my work on religious women on the veil. In other words, silence is inherent to the prison world, and it has a structuring function. So I too will keep silent and remain in my solitude as a researcher, analyzing, watching, and respecting without having the capacity to write everything, because no one is expected to achieve the impossible. However, I will always write to whom and for whom it is right to. I owe it to you because ultimately you are the one who makes the law. The worst thing about silence is that we can know why break it, but not always why we keep it. I will never know why I was arrested, why Roland had to suffer this fate, why my friends who love Iran and some of them work to better understand it and make it known will probably never be able to return there again. I will never know if the people who were in contact with me never contact with me were or will be worried. I would have liked to mention those who tirelessly supported me over these 4.5 years, but cannot do so for fear of compromising them, and therefore resolve to silence here too for lack of being able to be exhaustive. But I dedicate my writing to them and to all of you who have stayed by my side to defend scientific freedom, the only one that allows us to break the silence, to extricate ourselves from our solitude, to emerge from our minority in the spirit of the Enlightenment, which has never been so necessary. And by the power of a word, I begin my life again. I was born to know you, to name you freedom. Y por la magia de una palabra, comienzo comienzo de nuevo mi vida. Nací para conocerte, para llamarte libertad. با معجزه کلام آغاز میکنم شروع دوباره را. به دنیا آمدم که بخوانم تو را، که بدانم تو را. آزادی.
So thank you very much to the entire panel, all the panelists, for sharing with us both their scholarship, but also their journey as scholars and what inspired them to take the path that they have, which I think for most of us as scholars is often the road less traveled. In the interest of time, I thought that Dr. Brookshaw and I would each pose one question each to the panelists. And I'm going to, would you like to, okay, you want me to start? So I'm going to pose one question to all the panelists, and I hope you can take a moment to answer them. And then Dr. Brookshaw will ask the final one. The question that I would like to ask is this: what surprises or unexpected experiences did you encounter when you embarked on your journey as a scholar and a researcher? Were there any mistakes or regrets that you made that you can share? Thank you.
Somebody has to start it, right? This particular research for Hajj Sayya has two reasons. Obviously, once it started with the late Sadiq Shubak, the great Iranian writer. I was his neighbor, I was his close friend. And one night in his house, I was about to go to Japan to teach at the Gaigodai Tokyo University for Foreign Studies. And as I was about to go there, I said, I have a question when I go to Japan. At the time, it's 1980s, late 1980s. I thought that only Japan has succeeded in cracking the dilemma or the puzzle of modernity. It was the only Asian country that has done so. So I asked, I said, I want to explore this question before I go to Japan, because that's the question that in the next year, that actually ended up being 6 years that I would be living in Japan, I would like to answer that question. So anyway, that was how it started. And then as soon as I began to study him, I came upon serendipity. I mean, if I want to say something to the younger people, is always be alert to something that that is just there and it has not been seen before. As perhaps the only person who would know would be Dominic here. I was blessed to have found the oldest manuscript of the Hafiz, which was transcribed during his own lifetime. I mean, it's not a complete manuscript, it's only 50 ghazals. But the reason was it was serendipity. I mean, I was looking for something, but as I was looking for something, at the same time, I was not totally focused on that thing. I was allowing other little bits and things that are hidden there to speak to me. And so that's how I really ended up discovering it. And the same thing with Harsaya. It mentions that I went to the U.S. Delegation, U.S. Nowadays called embassy, that to find to basically because the government was after me, and I immediately thought maybe I can find documents in the State Department because there must have been communication. And so lo and behold, I found that. And then this is the book that I'm actually going to dedicate, to give it to Dr. Kashani-Sabet. I was going to say Firoozeh, but it just becomes too informal. And this is like the travel journals of Haj Sayyah in the United States, a critical edition, bilingual. I just did annotation. And I just say, after that, I just explore that. So that's how it started. I mean, and I stop here because I can go on.
Thank you so much.
I think this was a combination of a question of, just to get back, something that surprised me or was helpful?
Something that surprised you or a mistake that you made that you feel you can share?
Oh, I've made lots of mistakes, so that's clear. But I think something that led me towards this, I lived first in Iran, obviously, and then I lived for a while in Europe and then the United States. This sort of continental, I think, world, and really meeting interesting people who each have pushed me to one side has been really important to me. I can think as the first shocker was 7th grade, Athens. We're at Marathon, the Mounds. I'm the only Iranian, and everybody else is either Greek or British. And so I said, okay, this is where all the Persians are there. And they're, oh, you're the Persian one. So let's reenact it. And, the first time I thought, okay, we just had a revolution. I've sort of fled, actually, U.S. because of the hostage crisis, and now I'm the bad Persian from 2,500 years ago. And of course, it gets you in mind, what were we doing here? I mean, I still remember, I'm saying, why were they here? And of course, in that way, it led me towards some of the things that I later did. But this is the shocker for me, I think, was 7th grade.
Let me say, I forgot to say it was Chubak, Aghay Chubak, who told me, go and read Haj Sayyah. I forgot to say that.
Thank you both so much.
Okay, I think I addressed that issue. In my talk. I just think mistake, maybe I could placate academic egos a bit in my career. But I'm not sure if I could. It wasn't in my personality. I think a few times that I tried to do it, I didn't succeed because people came from viewed me from their stereotypes. And when the prejudice is so deeply rooted in people, it's useless. It's not going to go away. I think it's only experiences of life that's going to transform them. Sometimes I saw results, but I wasn't placating it. Like once I was at Tel Aviv University giving a talk, and after my talk, the discussant, political scientist, of course, came at me very hard, and I interrupted him and said, oh, I know who you are. I just finished reading your book. It's a good book. And he completely turned around. I mean, it was night and day. All of a sudden, he was smiling, laughing. His face changed, and he gave me a good review. He was ready to tear me into pieces. I think placating egos, maybe. I'm not sure.
I do not know what to say about this surprise. So when I started my thesis, the first book I read was the book of Eliz. But I was focusing on the Islamic woman. Was supposed what I was interested in was what is the difference between them and me. You know, I left Iran when I was 18, and many of my friends in school, it means ladies like me, were becoming Islamic. So what was surprising, they had the same, you know, as a we call them Islamic feminists. Nobody accept that, but anyway, I mean their integration, their goal, the way of living, and they projecting themselves in the future. All these things, we were so close but so different. That is very surprising. You know, you are with people that could make the whole universe scared because of this veil, but this word that come out from during the speech make them so, you know, so the people who look like you anyway, living in this time, in this period, in the modern time anyway, with the difference, of course there is difference, but not where we think about it. So this was a surprise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Brookshaw?
The question I wanted to ask was perhaps slightly broadening the panel, and was to ask a kind of two-pronged question of how do you see the broader field of Iranian studies developing over the next decade? And as a footnote to that, how would you hope that it would develop over the next decade?
I think for one thing, just having the conference here, I'd like to thank Dr. Mohammadi for really going out of her way, at least for myself, to make sure everything goes smoothly here. And the invitation, and of course everybody else who's been involved, is to get out of this America, North America, I mean Canada and US, and really discuss Iran in a sort of in the larger aspects in other places, such as Mexico, in Mexico City, and try to partner really with places that other organizations have been doing, India, and really make it global. And I think that is my wish. Now, I apologize, I'm an ancient historian. You could see I spoke about something maybe really irrelevant. Ever since I've been into the field, because of the Iranian Revolution, the focus has been so much, at least for the first 20 years. I remember what was the revolution, what happened, and it's been of course, it has impacted everybody's life. I still see as a historian, it is so top heavy. I talked to Nasrin Rahimi, my colleague and friend who was my boss, and of course, she's always says, you're always interested in antiquity. So we have this discussion. I think to understand Iran, you need to have conferences, but understand it on various levels and its various histories. Iran doesn't begin with the Safavids, or it doesn't begin with the Qajar or the Laz with the Russians. There are deep structures that it seems to be so conservative to just push it back to it, that you need to have, I think, a longer purview. And that's what I would propagate.
Okay, first of all, let me echo Dr. Daryaee's gratitude to Dr. Mohammadi. I personally also would like to say that. I meant to say it, but it was 20 minutes. I skipped over many things. I mean, I'm not basically in the field of Iranian scholarship. My interest is as someone who's trying to see how we can move Iran forward out of this impasse. My own feeling and experiences is Iran, the younger generation. I sometimes jokingly say, so Islam came and there was an event, a truth event, if you will, if you use Alam Badu's language. A truth event took place, and then Iran changed. And now unbeknownst to Muslims and to Iranians, all of a sudden the internet came, and now we have the third phase of the world history, including the Iranian history. So the younger generation in Iran are now growing up in a totally different context that my generation was growing up. And this new context is global. And so I would fully agree that we should really get out of this world order that meant that if you want to fly to Mexico, you have to go to New York. You know what I'm saying? That we have to really begin to think laterally and about the Middle East, because during the it never became really a revolution or was stillbirth, Egyptian uprising in 2011. I used to go there, and I was trying to learn from them, and I was trying to, in my own way, make sure that what happened to Iran would not happen to the Egyptians. And actually, it's one of the things that they would ask me. Some of the more kind of modernist people would say, "Oh, we don't want to become like Iran." And I said, "We didn't want to become like Iran either. It just happened." And so the question is, how we should begin to learn from each other, even as if you want to do political action. The situation in Egypt was more comparable to Iran than the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution that people were trying to learn from. So I think that if we begin to open up and compare and come into the community of nations that have similar experience in post-colonial situations, we can learn a lot more. I mean, we Iranians should not always compare. I don't speak as a scholar, but as an Iranian, compare ourselves with Sweden or United States or France. We should compare ourselves with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with Turkey, with other countries like ourselves, and learn how we can get, because many of us are dealing with these autocratic systems. How can we get out of it? Because it's a common situation, it's a common problem. What's in our cultures, in our literature, in our intellectual life, in our political life, that it keeps this thing happening? Because we cannot get rid of it. I mean, in terms, it's not like 50 years ago, 100 years. Today, it's possible to change the world. It has never been so easy to change the world, and yet it has never been so difficult to change it.
When I was in Iran for my field work, one of my classmates from graduate school was in Iran. When I met him, he said, "Are Iranian specialists doing research on this topic?" I said, "No." "Are they doing research on that topic?" I said, "No." "How about this one? How about that one?" I said, "No." And he got really agitated and he said, "What the hell are they doing? So what is the point of being in a democracy when they cannot write about these topics? We are limited here, but they are not limited." But there is a limitation. I think if you cannot freely go to the country, and if you cannot travel in the country and talk to people and objectively process that, then you are hindered. No matter what you say, how many theories you use, something is amiss. And I think that that was the point that I was trying to communicate to him. About the future of Iranian studies, I think it's important to contextualize with substance, not just a superficial comparison with other countries, but with substance, contextualize Iran. Iran has had a very unique and different experiences. And I think that contextualizing comparatively is very important. The other thing that I think is important is Iranians have a self-critical discourse naturally within them that many of those who are in the region do not have. And this is a major advantage for Iranian scholars and Iranians in general. Some of my favorite scholars come from Turkey. Turkish scholars, in my view, are outstanding in the way in which they have used partial democracy with many, many problems to communicate, come up with theories of nationalism or movements, social movements, and so on. And I think that will be a very good example to follow, considering, of course, that there is always this limitation for not being able to freely express yourself. If you do, then you cannot go back. If you go back, then there are consequences to it. So I think all of these should be taken into account.
It's okay. Yes, I'm going to follow what was said by Eliz. I totally agree. As an anthropologist, maybe we have different way of doing research, but as an anthropologist, this limitation is a real one, and it make us today a little bit put us in this very difficult situation. But I need also to say that what is happening in Iran is not just proper to Iran. If you look at Russia or China or Turkey, because you was talking about. So this is not monopolized by a political system. That is good to know in order to cope with this new situation. But what I want to say also is this new situation we are facing give us food to think about. First of all, look at how intellectuals in Iran are coping with this new situation. I didn't want Iranian to support my case. I know how dangerous is their life. But maybe I would like they make kind of mobilization to support our job as researchers, our university. After all, I was put in jail because what I was doing as researcher. And my university was put in question because called as a section of Ministry of Renseignement. What do you say it? Renseignement, security services. So I didn't want this normal researcher to take to take my defense, not at all. But maybe I was expecting few of them who are invited very often and who are called as a counselor of such and such minister or president and so on and so forth. I'm not going to call them, but because they know me, they know my university. So again, I didn't want they take my defense, but defense of our job, of university, of research. Really, that is the more important thing, and I just feel myself a little bit désarmé with no possibility to act, and I suffered because of this silence that's very dominant in Iran. But another thing is I discovered that our métier, our job, there is no status. We have no idea about the limit of our research, and we are disagree with each other. There is no one who is going to talk the same thing that his neighbor. Between colleagues, we have problem to talk about. So if you look at journalists, if you look at there is guild to defend them, but we have no possibility to be defended by a group, by a guild, by a corporation. I don't know, the cooperative, but something like that. And the last thing I want to say is to not neglect your fieldwork. That is my case. I am just reproaching myself. I was happy to do my research and to go out, and it was finished. I wrote my books in French, didn't care about the translation in Persian. So I didn't negotiate, I didn't communicate with Iranian society. So when I was in the jail, there was no possibility to tell Iranian that who is this spy the regime decided to put in the jail. What I was doing, what was my research, what I was doing, what I was, after all, it was 30 years of my life that I passed in Iran. So I had nothing to put on the table and to say, okay, this is the spy the regime is accusing, and what do you think about? Nobody was there also to defend. So that is, I think, the first thing, maybe not be happy to do research and to go out and to be happy to publish it and to finish with that. More communication with the field we are working on, whatever the field we are, Iran, Afghanistan, or Turkey, African studies. And the second thing, to be in communication with our colleagues and to know what they are doing in Iran. You know, if you call yourself colleagues and interested to come in Paris, whatever the meeting, I invite you, and you are not supposed to take advantage of to take the defense of the person who is in jail. Again, not my person, the defense of the research and the university. That is the way. So the limitation of our job is a real issue today, but you should tell also that if a lot of French these days avoid to go in Iran, you see a lot of German or a lot of Europe, North or American who come. So the situation is not closed, but please don't give the monopoly of the research to Iranian. What I want to say, this combination of the Iranian inside and outside produce huge work, fantastic one. You have a lot of people here. I'm not going to name because I'm going to forget a lot of them, so it's not good. But anyway, this is the price. So we should not give in to it. Thank you. So that is why. So please go on and insist to go on and to try to find a way to cope with this new situation, which is horrible. So you're right.
So thank you all so much. And thank you to all the panelists, Dr. Brookshaw, for helping me to moderate this conversation. So let's please give a huge round of applause for everyone. Thank you so much. So we'll look forward to seeing everyone again here at 5 p.m. for the awards ceremony. So don't miss it. Thank you.
Gobierno de México.